And welcome to Tim Alberta's triumphant return to Michigan State University. I am Matt Grossman, the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research here at MSU. We are pleased to be putting this on alongside the Department of Political Science, the Department of Religious Studies, the School of Journalism, and the LaFrac Forum and Symposium on Science, Reason, and Democracy. I think some of you know we'll also be having a book signing at Hooked at 6 p.m. and you all are welcome to come over for that as well. Tim Alberta is a graduate of Michigan State University and a writer at The Atlantic. He has also written for publications including National Journal, National Review, The Wall Street Journal, and Politico. And just I'll recommend three articles for all of you. One of my favorites is I think called John Boehner Unchained. Tim got to know John and knew him all along, but in his post-speakership, and so you get to hear the inside story of what it's like to try to lead the Republican caucus. Then after the shootings last year at MSU, he wrote a nice poignant article about MSU that all of you will like, I think called Requiem for the Spartans, about the role of MSU as an underdog. And to get pumped for this weekend, you can read Tim's remembrance of being a Lions fan for life when he sat through every game as an MSU undergrad in the 0-16 season. And it is called, I believe it's called the Thrill of Defeat, but we won't let that be an omen for transitioning for this weekend. Tim is also the author of a best-selling book called American Carnage on Trump and big changes in the Republican Party that he got to live through and write about. And his latest book, also on the New York Times bestseller list, is called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, about the evangelical movement in the age of extremism. Welcome, Tim Alberta.
Good afternoon. How is everybody doing? Lively, huh? Cool. All right, there we go, fabulous. So, okay, I have to admit, I've said this a couple of times today to different people, but now that I've got you all in one space, I moved back to Michigan about 4 years ago, and in that time, I've received, I think, 4 different speaking invitations at the University of Michigan, and this is my first one back here. So I was starting to really feel offended, starting to wonder if I made a professor mad somewhere along the way. I probably did, in fact, so maybe that was justified. But it is great to be in East Lansing, and I'm really happy that you all were willing to brave the climate and come out. I do not want to just sit up here and talk at you guys. I certainly could. There's a lot to talk about. I thought maybe what I would do is just offer sort of a couple of brief thoughts about this book and why I wrote it, and then just throw it open to some questions and hear what's on your mind. We were just meeting, a handful of us, and I was answering a question from a young man who I'm not sure if he walked over here with us or not. But he was asking, you know, if I'm a Christian, am I just to sort of cede my role in civic life? You know, are you telling me that Christians aren't supposed to be politically active, politically engaged? And if not, you know, what is the proper role? How do you strike that balance? And I want to talk a little bit about that with you and maybe share some things from my response to him, because it's a great question, and I think it's something that a lot of people of faith are grappling with in this moment, and it's not something new. That's maybe where I'd start by emphasizing that this question and when I say we, I am going to be using the capital W, we, a little bit here when I'm talking about we as Christians, we as evangelicals, because I have written this book as an insider. I was raised in the evangelical church. My dad was an evangelical pastor. He's gone now, went home to be with the Lord about 4 years ago, and I am unapologetically a Christian. And so I write this book from an unapologetically Christian perspective. I am also unapologetically a journalist, and I wrote this book from an unapologetically journalistic perspective, which is to say that in both callings for me as a Christian and as a journalist, I am called to pursue truth. And I am called to pursue truth even when it is uncomfortable. In fact, I am called to pursue truth especially when it is uncomfortable. I would quote a pastor friend of mine who likes to say that the Bible is a mirror that we hold up to ourselves to examine our own flaws, our own shortcomings, the ways in which we have fallen short of the perfect standard of Christ that is set out for us, and then to assess how we might do better, how we might improve, how we might draw closer to Him. I think in this climate, and I'm not talking about the snow on the ground outside, I'm talking about in this moment in American life of deep division, of intense tribal polarization, negative partisanship, very much an us versus them, zero-sum American moment that we're living through right now. It is easy for us to lose sight of what is supposed to be, for the Christian, our core identity. Now, I'm going to use that word a lot here in both my little homily to you and probably as we go back and forth with some Q&A. I think identity is an incredibly powerful thing. And when we talk about identity, often in American life, it will come back to, in some way, shape, or form, your tribal identity, the identity that you self-select into. So yes, you are an American, but what kind of American are you? Well, are you a conservative? Are you a progressive? Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? We have these sort of identity cliques that we fall into. And what I try to argue in the book is that if you are a Christian, that is, you are someone who has been born again and you believe that Jesus of Nazareth was not simply a historical figure, you believe that Jesus of Nazareth was in fact the Son of God, and that He was fully man and fully God, and that this was God taking on flesh to serve as a mediator between a broken humanity and a perfect God, and that only by the sacrifice of a perfect human who was also fully God, only by the sacrifice of that perfect spotless lamb, as they would try to pursue in the ancient world the sacrifice of the perfect spotless lamb, only by that sacrifice can the sinfulness and the brokenness and the depravity of man be atoned for, and only then can man be reconciled to God. Now, some of you are listening to this, surely, and thinking, that sounds crazy. I want no part to do with any of that. I can't believe this sophisticated person up here who writes for The Atlantic thinks that. That's okay. I don't blame you for thinking that at all, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about all of it. But if in fact you do believe that, if you do believe that being a follower of Jesus is more than just the jewelry you wear around your neck, or the bumper sticker on your car, or the way that you self-identify to a pollster when they call you on your cell phone, if in fact you haven't hung up on the pollster already, which you shouldn't because social science is very important, and we need that data. But if you are a follower of Jesus, then your identity is fundamentally rooted in being a disciple of Jesus. All other identities, all other affiliations, all other allegiances are secondary. The reason that I stress this is because when I get this smart question from this smart young man, I am reminded of the false choice that is foisted upon all of us every day living through, again, this very weird moment in American life, but specifically the false choice that confronts Christians, which is to say that, well, yes, you are called to love your neighbor. You're called to love your enemy and to pray for those who persecute you. You're called to turn the other cheek. You're called to treat the outsider with grace and mercy. And you are called to season your language with salt so that those who hear you may be drawn to your Father in heaven. Yes, those are commandments. Those are imperatives. Those are non-negotiables of the Christian faith. But have you seen what they're doing in American society? Have you seen the abortion policies? Have you seen the transgender stuff? Have you seen the drag queen story hour? Have you seen this concerted assault on the Judeo-Christian heritage of this country? Have you seen the systematic assault on our traditional values? Have you seen the ways in which they are attempting to marginalize us and ostracize us and persecute us and ultimately abolish and eradicate God from public life? Have you seen that? We have to do something about it. We can't just sit back and let it happen. So there is a false choice foisted upon the Christian who hears that. And the false choice is to stand back and let it happen and be politically passive or even politically separatist, which is to say to not be politically engaged at all and just to let the culture run roughshod over you and to say nothing and to do nothing and just to take it. Or it is to enlist with the likes of Charlie Kirk and Eric Metaxas and Donald Trump and to embrace a militant, blood and soil, God and country, retaliatory approach, saying that this is in fact zero-sum. Somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose. And I am going to fight on the side of Christian virtue. I'm going to fight on the side of God. I'm reminded of when George W. Bush in 2008, when the bank system was failing and when there needed to be a massive infusion of money into the financial markets in order to ward off basically a run on the banks and a situation where you would not have been able to go to the ATM in a couple of days and take any money out, and it would have been a catastrophic occurrence. Many of you in the room are too young to even remember this in 2008. But I'm reminded of when George W. Bush came out to give a speech explaining to the American people why he was authorizing this program. And George W. Bush said that in order to preserve the free markets, he had to first violate free market principles. And many Christians today have become convinced that in order to preserve Christian virtue in this country, they need to first do away with Christian virtue, which is to say that they believe the barbarians are at the gates, and therefore they need a barbarian to go and do the fighting for them. That, in a nutshell, is the evangelical relationship with Donald Trump. And that relationship has evolved. If you look at the entry polling, it's Iowa. Everything has to be weird and different in Iowa, so instead of exit polling, they have entry polling. Bear with me on this. But if you go back in time, 8 years, and you look at the entry polling in Iowa in 2016, what you saw then was that Donald Trump would have won the Iowa caucuses, except for the fact that he underperformed severely among self-identified Christians. Trump won among all Iowa caucus goers who did not identify as evangelical Christians, but he lost so badly among those who did that Ted Cruz was able to beat him in 2016 in Iowa. And actually, if you look at the exit polling in all of the states that followed over the subsequent 10 weeks or so, that same pattern played out again and again and again and again. Trump lost among evangelicals, but he won among non-evangelicals. What's the reason I'm emphasizing that? It's to say that Trump has not always had this stranglehold on the community that he does today, and people are trying to understand why. If you look at 2016, after Trump was able to eventually win the primary, All of the polling, both internal to his campaign and external, all of the public polling showed the same thing, which was that Trump was struggling mightily with one group in particular. One group that if they did not show out in full force in the general election in November, he would have no chance of winning the general election, and that was with white evangelicals. So Trump, in 2016, made a point in a period of about 12 weeks or so of laser focusing, he and his campaign, everything they did, all of their messaging, all of their get out the vote, all of their organizing efforts were aimed squarely at evangelicals. And this was a period of time in which he put Mike Pence on the ticket. He released a list of Supreme Court nominees. He pledged that he would only appoint pro-life judges to the bench. He started talking about the Johnson Amendment, which many people had never even heard a politician talk about before, but talking about this idea that he would not allow the government to come after churches if pastors engaged in political speech from the pulpit. All of this and more was aimed at assuaging the doubts and sort of countering the suspicions of these evangelical voters in 2016. That's what a hole he was in that he was trying to dig himself out of. In fact, in the summer of 2016, Trump convened many hundreds of evangelical leaders in a big ballroom at the Marriott Marquis Hotel in New York City. I was there. I was covering it as a reporter. And I spent the entire day there, talked to dozens and dozens of people. And on stage with him that day were the likes of Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell Jr., son of Falwell Sr., Mike Huckabee, Ben Carson, among a number of prominent conservative evangelical leaders. And one after another, they all got up on stage and they basically said, look, God uses flawed people all throughout Scripture. Donald Trump is not a perfect man. Heck, he's maybe not one of us, but he will fight for us. And look, folks, this is a binary choice. It's a lesser of two evils. Do you want a President Hillary Clinton and 2 or 3 pro-choice Supreme Court justices on the bench? Or do you want to roll the dice on this guy? That was the argument, right? That seems like ancient history, of course, because you fast forward 8 years, and there is this feverish, cult-like attachment to Donald Trump among these evangelicals. Whereas he wins 21% of them in Iowa 8 years ago, he wins 53% of them the other night. And you're trying to understand why. What has changed? How has it gone from the lesser of two evils and a binary choice and a transactional relationship where Trump says very openly, look, I'm not one of you. 2 Corinthians, right? Like, listen, I'm going to give you the policies that you want, and you're going to give me your votes. It's that simple, right? And that was enough. It was enough to get Trump elected narrowly. Trump wins by 77,744 votes in 3 states combined in 2016, gets across the finish line, but then something very strange starts to happen during his presidency, and I'm documenting it in real time as I'm covering him, as I'm covering his White House, as I'm writing this first book that came out in 2019, which is available on paperback, by the way. Now, nobody laughs when I say that. These evangelicals who had been Trump's softest supporters, suddenly, through the trials and tribulations of his presidency, they're becoming his staunchest supporters. He's got other people who are falling off. He's losing some ground with suburbanites and with moderates and with independents and but white self-identified evangelicals, they are rallying and they are staying with him in ways that no other voting bloc is. And you get to the 2024 primary, and you've got other Republicans who are running for president who are actual evangelicals, like Mike Pence, his former vice president. And I'll tell you, there have been few experiences in my entire reporting career more eye-opening to me than a couple of years ago when I was in a hotel ballroom in Nashville, Tennessee, at the annual Faith and Freedom Coalition gathering, and Donald Trump came to give the keynote address. Now, this group has been sort of Mike Pence's baby for years. I mean, these are his people. This is his constituency. Mike Pence, an authentic, born-again, evangelical Christian who starts every speech of his entire political career by saying, I am a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order, right? That is Mike Pence. The guy who won't go out at night unless his wife is with him, the guy who has an entire moral code built around his religious beliefs. Mike Pence had been the kind of the carrier of the torch for this organization for years. They loved him. And Donald Trump gets up in front of the room, in front of this audience, and for the first time since their very public falling out on January 6, 2021, Donald Trump starts tearing into Mike Pence. Basically calls him a coward and makes fun of him and lets him have it right then and there. And it was shocking because he hadn't really said anything about Pence publicly up until that point. But what was really shocking was the response. The crowd went bananas. They're cheering for Trump, and then every mention of Pence's name, they're booing. And I'm in the back of the ballroom looking around, thinking, oh boy, what have we here? Now, you might ask yourself, if it was just this transactional relationship, and if he was the lesser of two evils, and it was a binary choice in a general election against Hillary Clinton, but now they have an off-ramp. Now they have an opportunity with an upcoming primary. He's not the president anymore. They can choose whoever they want. Why are they cheering for Donald Trump? But even more, why are they booing their brother, Mike Pence? I'm glad you asked. It is my view that one of the enduring legacies of Donald Trump will be that he has reconditioned the evangelical mind in this country to expect and demand something more than just piety from a politician, to demand more than just a set of social convictions, to demand more than spiritual authenticity. That stuff isn't enough anymore. Why? Because the barbarians are at the gates. I heard Mike Pence give a speech out at Hillsdale, a year and a half ago maybe it was. And it was just before he was, I think it was like right at his campaign launch. So he comes out, he's speaking in this beautiful chapel in the middle of the Hillsdale campus. If you've never seen it, it's like really something to behold. And he's up in the pulpit and he's giving this speech, and it's just crickets. It's polite, it's Hillsdale, so they're not gonna like boo him out of the place, right? But nobody's really cheering. And at one point, Pence is describing himself and remembering how in his talk radio days as a young man, how he was Rush Limbaugh on decaf. That was his like nickname, I guess. And he's saying that to emphasize the point that, you know, you can be conservative and you can fight, you know, for conservative value, but you can also be decent and you can be kind and you can be humble. And Pence was saying all of this to an audience at Hillsdale there that just was sort of looking at him with their heads cocked to the side. And afterwards, I start talking to all of these people in attendance, students and donors and all these people who are going to be Republican primary voters. And one after the other, they're all saying the same thing. It was perfectly crystallized by this one man who was an evangelical attorney from the Detroit area who'd driven out. And he said, decaf? Decaf? Have you seen what they're doing to this country? We don't need decaf. We need the real thing. Listen, sometimes writers just get gifted these vignettes where like it doesn't get any better than that, right? That exchange is pretty much, in a nutshell, the evolution of the attitude. In other words, Donald Trump was able to render Mike Pence, of all people, he was able to render Mike Pence as no longer acceptable to these people. Mike Pence, who on every issue they care about is farther to the right than Trump himself, on the abortion question, on the sexuality question, all of it, all these core social issues that have animated the evangelical base for decades. Pence is more conservative than Trump on any of those things. But what was Pence not willing to do? Suspend the Constitution. Right? I mean, really. Pence wasn't willing to do what needed to be done. Therefore, he's not good enough. Neither is Ron DeSantis. Neither is Tim Scott. Neither is Nikki Haley, right? They have a choice. They have an off-ramp. They are not taking it. Now, when I say they, and I probably should have emphasized this right off the bat, as I do in the book, because it's important, when we talk about evangelicals, these are tens of millions of people, right? And they run a huge, vast, diverse spectrum. And I know people at both far ends of the spectrum, and I want to emphasize that I am not talking about a monolithic group here, and even when I am talking about certain sects of this group that have done, I think, profound damage to their own cause, and more importantly, done profound damage to the credibility of the witness for Jesus Christ, I love these people, and I have great empathy for these people, and I think that many of them have lost their way, and they have been lied to, and they have been manipulated systematically by powerful people with powerful interests. And I want to address the nuances in this community with compassion and the proper complexity, okay? But I think we also have to call a spade in dealing with this moment where we are right now. You have what appears to be consistently, not just from Iowa, but from all the polling that we see, consistently a majority of self-identified evangelicals in this country who have set aside their identity as Christians because it is no longer as central to them, it is no longer as relevant to them in this moment as their identity as partisan, conservative, Republican, Trumpian culture warriors, however you want to think about it. Now, that's a provocative thing to say, right? There are a couple of things that I would back that up with. For one thing, and this is some of the most fascinating data that we've seen in a long time in this country, but we saw during the Trump years data that showed that among white Trump voters throughout his 4 years in office, more and more of them were self-identifying as evangelicals, even as fewer and fewer of them were attending church, right? I see heads nodding. So this is a social phenomenon. This is a cultural phenomenon. It is a partisan political phenomenon. But it is not necessarily a spiritual phenomenon. Now, let's be clear. There are lots of people who are in church every Sunday and every Wednesday who are card-carrying Trump supporters. So I'm not suggesting that all of these people are actually, fake evangelicals and fake churchgoers. That's not the case. But as a marker of shared identity, it is really quite interesting that to be an evangelical today in the public consciousness means something altogether different than it meant just 20 or 30 years ago. And there is a reason, I would add, that according to all the data, non-white Christians are far less likely to identify as evangelical than are white Christians. We see those numbers time and again. I'll say that one more time just to make sure you caught it. Non-white Christians, even those who attend conservative or reformed churches, are far less likely themselves to identify as evangelical because of the political connotations. They don't want to be known as evangelicals, right? Because they know what it means to be an evangelical to the world outside. And by the way, sort of in the subtext of that, some of you might ask, what does it mean to be an evangelical anyway? Right? Again, glad you asked. Part of what it means to be an evangelical is not just, I don't want to get deep into the weeds on the sort of the tradition splits and all of the doctrinal stuff. It's a different speech, and we can do some of it in the Q&A if you'd like. One of the key components of evangelicalism is the verb evangelize. You are evangelizing. You are taking the good news to all the nations as is consistent with with the Great Commission. And to evangelize to an unbelieving world becomes very difficult when that unbelieving world sees evangelical as just a partisan political cover, right? They see the church as being a means to an end, the end being winning elections, dominating the culture wars, subjugating your opponents. Listen, I can get to that end without giving up a Sunday morning, right? That's how a lot of people will view it. So they see the corruption, they see the duplicities, they see the hypocrisy in the evangelical world, and they want nothing to do with evangelicalism, which I don't entirely blame them. Why is it that in this moment, so many of my brothers and sisters, and if you're in the room, if you are a fellow believer, our brothers and sisters have chosen this path? I'll wrap up my remarks here, and it's back where I started, because I think it's very important to that young man's question earlier. I believe that there is a choice, not a false choice like the ones that I laid out earlier, but a choice that is fundamental to the identity of a follower of Jesus Christ. It's a choice that dates back several thousand years. If you recall, for those of you who are versed biblically, on the night of Jesus' arrest, his right-hand disciple, Peter, pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the officers arresting Jesus, right? And what does Jesus say to him? He rebukes him. He says, "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." He heals the man's ear. Now that same character, Peter, the hothead, right? That same character, some years later, while he's imprisoned and he's awaiting his execution by the state of Rome, that same person is writing his epistles to believers in the ancient world, telling them that despite the fact that you are persecuted, that you are marginalized, that you are imprisoned, that you may be being led to your death, as I am about to be, you are to represent your identity in Christ by showing grace and humility and mercy and kindness and love, especially toward those who are doing you harm. Because that is a reflection of Christ into the world around you. Think about, I'm a journalist, so I'm big on character arcs, but for any of you who have a favorite Netflix show, it's the same thing. You want to talk about a character arc. How did that guy get from here to there? Because he has been transformed by Christ. His heart, his soul has been transformed. There has been a choice for 2,000 years for every Christian who has ever felt threatened, who has ever felt oppressed, who has ever felt persecuted. And that choice is very simple. You can reach for the sword to defend yourself. And that sword can be military power, it can be political influence, it can be the promises and the rhetoric of a strong man who says that they're going to protect you and defeat your enemies and keep you safe. You can reach for that sword. And that's what Christians began to do in the 4th century, around the time of Constantine. Ever since the merger of church and state, there has been this constant temptation for Christians in moments of crisis to run into the arms of the state, to grab that sword, to slay their enemies, and to preserve their status, their influence, their control of the world around them. It sounds great, and boy, is it tempting. You want to talk about temptation? In the epigraph of my book, I describe Jesus in the wilderness with Satan taking him up to the high mountain and in a moment of time showing him all the kingdoms of the world. And Satan says to Jesus, some of you know the story, of course, says, all of this, all of the power and all of the glory can be yours if you will but bow down to me. And there's a reason that Jesus is called the second and the better Adam, because where Adam failed in the Garden of Eden, and he gave into that temptation, Jesus rebukes Satan and says, "Get behind me. For it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and only him shall you serve." That temptation that Adam failed and that Jesus got right, it is the same temptation we face every day to dominate the world around us, to have the power, to have the glory, to rule. And to rule, you need the sword. But Jesus said that he came not to be served, but to serve. Jesus said, only if you are willing to lose your life will you find it. Jesus said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Mark 8:36. Think about those words. As I said to some of these students earlier, that is not a rhetorical question. That is Jesus staring you in the eyes and saying, what good does it do you to gain the whole world, yet forfeit your soul? That is what you are doing when you reach for the sword. Now you have an option. You can reach for the sword, or you can reach for the cross. That is the fundamental choice. For Christians, for 2,000 years, it has been the fundamental choice. And let me say with all due humility, it is a choice that we as Americans are really struggling with, because we don't know what it's like to face real persecution. We don't know what it's like to really live on the margins of society. We don't know what it's like to not have power and influence and control. My mother is overseas right now doing missionary work. I've been overseas doing missionary work. I have friends in the field right now doing missionary work who we support. There are Christians all over the world who know none of the comforts that we know here, who have none of the political influence, who can call in none of the favors. They're happy, they're joyful, they're content, they're full of grace, because they're not consumed with an identity that is in conflict with their true identity in Christ. And that, for us as Americans, when we hear Jesus say the first shall be last and the last shall be first, we respond by saying, what kind of socialist indoctrination is that? Really? The last shall be first? That doesn't sound so good to me. How difficult is it for the American in our place of comfort and wealth and privilege to appreciate the teachings of a poor, vagrant, part-time carpenter from the ghettos of Nazareth who traveled around with 12 weirdos trying to tell everybody that there was actually a new kingdom that had come. And it had nothing to do with the Pharisees and their long flowing robes. It had nothing to do with the Romans. But that they had a new kingdom that they had their citizenship in. Sounds pretty strange, doesn't it? And then they hang this guy on a tree, naked, for everybody to see. How unlikely is it that the Jews in that time, who had been living by strict ethnic customs for thousands of years, right? Thousands of years. And they're all terrified because now this guy's been hung on a tree for all of them to see. And he's been put in a tomb. And all of them go into hiding because they're terrified. And suddenly, within a few weeks, all of these people who have been living this way for thousands of years, they've completely changed. They're not worshiping on Saturdays anymore, they're worshiping on Sundays. They don't care about not eating pork anymore. Matter of fact, they're going to eat pork right in front of you. Their ethnic enemies who they've been at war with for millennia, suddenly they're calling them brothers and sisters and they're worshiping together. What could possibly have changed all of these people in that very short period of time? Something happened, right? Something happened, and they were willing, in the first century context, under brutal Roman occupation, they were willing and so convicted and so convinced of this, that they were willing to choose the cross. They were willing to be persecuted. They were willing to be marginalized. They were willing to be martyred for their faith. They were willing to live the most unglorious and unpowerful existence possible because they had a kingdom that they knew they were inheriting. We have a kingdom here. And I'm pretty sure a lot of us are too afraid of what might happen if we might give it up. And so time and again, we reach for that sword. That's why I wrote the book. I'm deeply concerned, not just about the implications of the radicalizing of the American church and what it will do to a pluralistic society that needs to respect differences in religious tradition. I'm even more concerned about the unraveling of the institution of Christianity in this country and the reputational harm that makes it so difficult for those in the world who need Christ in their lives and who need to know who this vagrant preacher from the ghettos of Nazareth was and what this kingdom that he preached is all about. Because the claims he makes in the book of John, that no one can find the Father, no one can get to heaven, no one can earn eternal life without him, it is such an absurdly exclusive claim that it is either ridiculously untrue and worthy of all of our scorn, or it is the best news that the world has ever received. It cannot be anything in between. And my fear is that we are unable to even have that conversation about this thing that is so important, that is so foundational, because Christianity has so gotten in the way of Christ. I apologize for going a little bit long. I'm going to stay as long as is needed to answer as many questions as I can answer. If you have tomatoes and you want to throw them, now would be the time. And I will gladly, I know we've got a microphone to circulate, so if anybody has questions, either throw up a hand or just shout it out. Not everybody at once. Sir.
You said that, as you see more and more people identify as evangelical, but fewer of them going to church, from a journalistic sense, was there any debate about what you should be calling the evangelicals, whether or not you should use the label evangelical or not?
Yeah, so that's actually a really, really good question. It's a similar question, frankly, to the one that I wrestled with around January 6th of 2021, because when you had these Republican politicians coming out and saying that they were in the 3 or 4 weeks leading up to January 6th, you had all these Republican politicians who were signing their names onto legal efforts and parliamentary maneuverings, and then who were signaling support for various things that were without precedent and that were antithetical to the institutions of self-government of this country. And yet, all the headlines spotlighting those people and what they were doing was always saying, conservative Jim Jordan, conservative Ted Cruz. And so I threw a bit of a hissy fit and went on cable news and wrote something at the time about it, and then I got, boy, did the death threats come after this. But I wrote and it said, why are we calling these people conservatives? What are they conserving exactly, right? I've known Jim Jordan for years. I've known Ted Cruz for years. I've spent a lot of time with these guys, right? I think in some things that they support, sure, they're conservative. But why are we just blanket labeling them conservatives when the thing that they are doing in this moment, that I would argue is perhaps the most significant political action they will ever take, is anything but conservative, right? So I'm just using that as a sort of analog because I think, there's a real problem to me. As I said to some of the students earlier, 53% of the Iowa caucus goers the other night self-identified as evangelical. So there were about 100,000 votes cast. So that means 53,000 people who came to vote would call themselves evangelical. My guess is if I asked those 53,000 people to define the Bennington Quadrilateral or to recite to me any of the ancient creeds or to explain to me Matthew chapter 5, my hunch is that of those 53,000 people, maybe maybe 10,000 could do that, right? So for the others, and that's not to say that the other 43,000 don't go to church, right? It's probably a mix. But for the others who can't, I mean, it would be a little bit like, there's a big game on, Izzo and the boys finally figure out a way to get the offense moving in the half court, and they find their way into the tournament, and they get to the Final Four. And yeah, I just took a little shot at the offense a minute ago. But they get into the tournament, and they make their way to the Final Four, right? And you go to the Riv, or you go to Harper's, you go to some big Spartan sports bar. You're all decked out in your stuff, right? And the game starts, and you're sitting with all these other fans. And like Malik Hall goes to the line, and somebody comes up to you and they're like, hey, who is that? Who's 25? And you're like, oh, okay. Then a minute later, Tyson Walker hits a dagger, and this person's like, hey, who is that? Who's number 2? And you're like, you get where I'm going with this, right? Like, either you know this stuff or you don't. Either you are a member of this tribe and you've invested the time to actually represent the tribe to the world around you, or you don't. You don't get to have it both ways. So like, yeah, you're faking it as a Michigan State fan. You're a State fan, but like, are you really? And I think that does pose a journalistic dilemma for me, and I try to explore that in the book a little bit because, a lot of, listen, I have a lot of people in my life who are, to their core, exemplars of what it means to be followers of Christ, and who proudly wear that label of evangelical in ways that I'm not very proud to wear anymore, and that frankly, I wouldn't volunteer, because I just don't believe that I fear that it does more harm than good. Those people, though, are getting a bad rap from a lot of others who aren't willing to put in the time, who are more discipled and more formed by Fox News 5 nights a week than they are by their preacher on Sunday morning. And that's at the core of the problem for me. Thanks for the question. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm wondering how much leeway and benefit of doubt do we give like these far-right extremist evangelicals when they've been like lied to and manipulated by Trump, when political violence has been at such an upstrike, like in recent years and whatnot?
Yeah, boy, this is another question that I wrestle with a lot. It's funny because on January 6th, when you saw those crowds forming outside the Capitol, now I was here, I was not there that day, but I spent 10 years of my life working inside that building every day, and I know it really well. I know a lot of the Capitol Police really well. And it was a really heartbreaking thing to watch unfold. But I remember thinking that as they were gathering on the lawn of the Capitol, I had this flashback to about 10 years earlier when probably a lot of those same people were gathering for Tea Party rallies in that exact same spot. And that day they were all chanting about limited government and Obama being an imperial president and the overreach and the abuses of the executive and all of this stuff, right? And then 10 years later they're back in that same spot and they're chanting about wanting to unilaterally overturn the election results, and they were going to hang Mike Pence if he didn't. And all I could sort of think in that moment was about just the scale of the lies and the manipulation. This is not to say that these people need to be infantilized. This is not to say that they are not accountable, that they have no agency in any of this, because they do. But I choose personally, just as a journalistic priority, I choose to focus much of my time and attention on the people who are doing the manipulation and who are doing the lying, rather than the people who they are lying to. So, because I really do believe, and I continue to hold to the conviction in my heart that many of these people, I have traveled everywhere, especially since COVID, where I just basically spent a couple of years in my truck just driving around the country, talking with voters and trying to understand what was happening in this country from the bottom up. I truly believe that most of these people are still good and decent people. I think a lot of them are scared. I think a lot of them are anxious. I think a lot of them are lonely. We have an epidemic of loneliness and depression in this country. And they have found in this movement this sort of shared identity that they have not found anywhere else. If you've ever heard of the book Bowling Alone, if you've never read it or heard, I would highly recommend it. So I think that it's interesting. Like, I've even spent a lot of time going to gun shows in the last few years. And you'll see these people convening at gun shows. And they'll be there for hours. And they walk out and they haven't bought a thing. Why are they there? Community, it's shared identity, right? They have found something. And my sense in the Trump movement, having interviewed thousands of his voters, gone to dozens and dozens of his rallies, I believe that a lot of these folks have sort of willfully suspended some of their critical thinking and gone along with something that they probably at some subconscious level know is not right. But they do it out of fear, they do it out of anxiety, and they do it because they have been lied to for so long that they can no longer discern truth from lie. And I'm not letting them off the hook for that, but I just choose to place the onus on the people who are lying to them. And so that's why I will hold nothing back when it comes to the guy, Ralph Reed, who convenes the Faith and Freedom Coalition gathering in Nashville, when all these people are doing their blood and soil, God and country chanting rituals. And I talk to a lot of these people, and I can tell that they've just sort of been brainwashed. But Ralph Reed, I know Ralph, and this is being taped. If he's watching, Ralph, I know you, right? I don't care. I know Ralph, and I know that he knows that 90% of this stuff they're hearing from the stage is nonsense. It's BS. He knows it. He convenes this thing. He brings all these speakers out to scare the hell out of all these people in his audience, and he's sitting backstage laughing all the way to the bank. He knows that it's a lie, but it's a lie that is very profitable for him. And that is the political moment that we're living through. I mean, and to be clear, this has always been a bug of our politics, but now it's a feature. It's not a bug. And it has been scaled up in a way that has led millions and millions of people who I think are good, decent people to do the wrong thing.
Thank you. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking talk. The Bible contains arguably the most beautiful sentence ever uttered by our species. Do unto others as I would have done unto myself, or love thy neighbour as thyself. So it seems to me that evangelicals have always had an option to promote neighbourliness, to promote equity and empathy. And there's obviously a very strong affinity between those things and left-wing ideals of equally sharing, of avoiding extremes of hierarchy, of being slow to judge. And yet, for the most part, at least in my knowledge, American evangelical churches have not tended to do that. There are obviously notable exceptions, but they have tended to be, even when sincere, largely pro-white, pro-patriarchy, anti-communist, anti-redistribution, anti-urban. So could you reflect a little on why, long before Trump began to be this great corrupter, evangelical religion has generally failed to enact the most important and beautiful line of the entire book?
I can try. I fear that it's too long of an answer to give here, but I will condense it. And I spend chapter 3 of my book really, it's about the longest chapter of any book you'll probably ever read, but it is a detailed history from the 1950s onward to understand the rise of the moral majority, the fusion of sort of Republican political identity, of conservative political identity with conservative theological identity, and how the two sort of came to be in an unholy alliance. Let me just say this, first and foremost. I am a big believer, as a pastor friend of mine said, that Jesus was political, but Jesus was not partisan. And I would warn anyone listening whether they're a part of a conservative evangelical church or they're a part of a liberal mainline church or whatever their faith tradition is, that Jesus is not a mascot for the donkeys or the elephants. Okay? He represents something slightly more important. Now, it is true, and I point this out in a different chapter in my book when I'm talking with an Australian theologian, brilliant man named John Dixon, who teaches at Wheaton College. And he says to me, I will attempt his Australian accent. He says, mate, in Australia, the evangelicals there, we support universal health care. It's a 2% levy on our salaries, and it pays the medical bills for everyone in the country. But if you do that in America, you're a socialist. I don't understand it, mate. Was that a decent... Not really. Okay, I won't do it again. He gets very fired up talking about this, right? So there is obviously something uniquely American about this fusion of politics and political identity with religious identity. In fact, I share this anecdote in, I think, the first chapter of my book, where I came home to visit my church. When I was living in Washington, D.C., I came home to visit my family, and there was a video played. This was during the heat of the Obamacare battle in Congress, and there was a video played in the sanctuary, like during the announcements time, about the menace of Obamacare. And it was like Christian pastors needing to come together to fight against Obamacare. And I said to my dad afterward, I'm like, that is wildly inappropriate, I feel like, to show inside of a church. And he disagreed. And we had a very robust conversation about that. I think the shortest answer I can give is if you look back to the 1960s and 1970s, and when you see a significant and rather abrupt leftward lurch in the culture and in our politics. So in a space of a few years, you have Supreme Court rulings banning prayer in public schools, legalizing abortion. You know, the pornography culture is rampant, the drug culture is rampant, it's the sexual revolution. The country is changing dramatically in real time. And you have all of these conservative Christians who suddenly see their kind of idealized Judeo-Christian nation slipping away from them. And they feel the need to sort of mobilize to take it back, mobilize politically to take it back. And what winds up happening is you have this kind of, initially it's slow and a little bit clunky, but then it kind of picks up steam and it becomes almost effortless, this synthesizing of, again, sort of conservative politics and conservative policy preferences with kind of cultural and social and theological conservatism, which, again, are very different things. So that same Australian theologian who has no issue with socialized medicine because he believes that it is actually that it is in alignment with his theology, he is also ardently opposed to abortion because he believes that life is made in the image of God and that he is called, as a political matter, to try to do whatever he can in the civic arena to protect life at all stages, right? So I think wherever you may fall, wherever I may fall on that spectrum of issues, right, left, and how it sort of intersects with our theology, I think the question is one of consistency. It's not about are we overloaded to the right or are we overloaded to the left? I think the left-right paradigm does a disservice to us in every facet of life, but especially when it comes to Christian life. I think the question is not left or right, but of right or wrong. And if you are practicing a sound, discipled Christian theology, and if you hold to a serious, mature, self-interrogating Christian doctrine, then I think that you are probably going to find yourself in a state of partisan homelessness, because you will never line up neatly with any party's political platform. If you find yourself in total alignment with a party's political platform, then I think you have a serious theological problem on your hands, rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. Sir.
Thank you very much. So it sounds to me like you're sort of setting up a puzzle in the beginning here. Is basically how can all these good Christians behave so immorally, right? But I'm wondering, in what point in history, American or global, can we actually see that Christians are acting with a higher sense of morality than non-Christians. It doesn't seem to me that this point in time is particular in any way in that sense, that religion tends to always be weaponized for power. And this is not anything new in that sense.
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. I think what you would find, respectfully, if you look through the history of social welfare in this country and in most developed countries over the last 3 or 4 centuries, what you would find, is my mic still on? I don't think so. It might have cut out, but that's okay. I can just project. I think what you would find is that in almost no developed nation has there been any serious social infrastructure built without the hand of the church involved in it. If you go back to the 4th and 5th centuries, the very origins of public medicine and of hospital care came from the church. Most of the care for orphans and widows came from the church. In other words, long before there was any role for government in caring for vulnerable citizens, all of that work was done by civic society, i.e., really, the church in those nations. And today, in developing nations or in nations that are, or in areas of the world that are in terrible poverty, most of what you will find as far as social welfare programs being implemented there, money coming in, clean water, food, medical supplies, almost entirely driven by Christian organizations. In fact, there's I won't be able to cite it from memory, but the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States of America, a denomination born out of being opposed to abolitionist movements. Pardon me. So I will often get the question about, excuse me again, I'll often get the question about race and the role that race plays in this. And I document in detail in my book the sordid history of the Southern Baptist Convention being formed as an explicitly pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist entity, and it has now grown into the largest denomination in the United States of America. And so you can sort of, and it is fractured deeply to this day by this original sin of slavery and racism, and I don't think that's an accident. I think we are reaping what we have sown in that respect. And yet, that same denomination that I have been very hard on in covering, that same denomination every year raises hundreds of millions of dollars that it sends overseas and sends tens of thousands of its church members all around the world to care for the sick and for the poor and for those who cannot care for themselves. So I would caution you that if you are not well acquainted with those efforts, that to do some of the research on that, because I think you would be astonished at what you find. The other thing I would say is that I quote a pastor in the 2nd chapter of my book who was very nearly run out of his own congregation a couple of years ago because he had the audacity to talk about the need for racial reconciliation. He had the audacity to shut his church down for a period of time during COVID. He had the audacity to basically not bow the knee to Donald Trump from the pulpit, and for that he became an apostate and a Marxist and a critical race theorist and everything else. And there was a cabal that formed in his church to basically come after him, and they engaged in a prolonged campaign of psychological warfare against this man, making threats to him. It was really quite something. And yet, he was describing to me, he and a friend were describing to me how some of the church members who were the farthest off the reservation, who had really badly lost the plot and who were flirting deep into conspiracy land now, were some of the most generous people in the church in terms of writing checks to charities, and which is sort of boggles your mind. And he described it to me, he said, this is both the best of the evangelical Christian experience and the worst of the evangelical Christian experience. So you can look at this and say, well, how is this possible, right? How could someone be both a sort of a militant, aggressive, antagonistic force in the culture wars and politically and treat people so terribly, and yet turn around and give money extravagantly to all of these social causes to help people who are so desperately in need of it. I think it's a window into our brokenness and our perpetual need for Christ in our lives. If you were to look back through the centuries and go century by century, you would see the Crusades and you would see the establishment of the medical system, right? You would see the conflict in the Balkans and the ethnic cleansing and the genocide, and you would see massive and overwhelming humanitarian efforts. So there's not an easy answer to this, and I think that the conflict that rages there is actually quite consistent with the conflict that I'm describing elsewhere.
Hey, so I want to take the question from like the scope of like all global history over the last 2,000 years to like the very local now. And you're a Michigander, and Barbara Walters' book, I think it's called like How Civil War Starts, or is it? She starts that book about the likelihood of civil war happening in the U.S. in Michigan, and it kind of makes an argument that if civil war is going to start in the United States, it's going to start. Michigan would be a decent place for it to start. And so I'm wondering, on the basis of like what you've been studying, what can you say about evangelical communities in Michigan? You've had some very, prominent, large evangelical churches in the state, but also some separatist groups, militant groups, right? What's going on more locally that sort of ties into what you're talking about in your book? Yeah.
Well, first of all, what an honor, for Barbara Walters to choose us. It's great. So I'm glad you asked, because that actually dovetails off this gentleman's question a little bit. I've been thinking about this. I have a chapter in the book that I write from France, where I'm talking with a couple of scholars, one of whom was raised in the former Yugoslavia and left just before the Civil War broke out, and one of whom is actively in exile from the Russian Orthodox Church. He actually at one point was the right-hand man to Patriarch Kirill, which I don't know how many of you are super well versed in what's happening in Russia and with the war in Ukraine, but Patriarch Kirill is the second most powerful man in Russia, next to Vladimir Putin, and he really was the one who supplied the religious justification to invade Ukraine. And I was talking with these two scholars, both of whom have seen in their motherlands this identitarian conflict break out and claim, combined millions of lives. And what was so interesting is they kept coming back to this idea of when religion is used to justify conflict, and when religion is used to justify conflict, how it can then morph from religion into civil religion or even into a political religion. I don't want to be dramatic. I don't want to be, I don't want to be catastrophizing for sport up here, okay? But I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't look at the ingredients in this moment. If you don't look at the cult-like attachment to Donald Trump, if you don't look at the fact that the other night at his rally, he's playing a video where the narrator's voice is coming over and describing Donald Trump as a shepherd to all of mankind and a protector, if you don't think about some of the religious fanaticism and the spiritual language being deployed as a means of not only supporting a candidate for office, but really in service of reclaiming something that they believe is rightfully theirs, these are the ingredients that can often lead to mass conflict. And I think what history tends to show us is that authoritarianism is really dangerous, right? And that religious identitarian zealotry is really dangerous. But when you fuse the two of them together, you get crimes against humanity. You get ethnic cleansing. You get genocide. You get 6 million Jews extinguished with a twisted cross in the background. I am not saying that's where we are, but I'm saying that anybody who looks at this in its totality and assesses it with clear eyes and with an objective, fair-minded, historically rooted sense of things, I think you have to be concerned about the trajectory that we are on. I don't know that we are ever necessarily in danger of replaying 1861 because of the ways that we operate now, because of the size of the federal government, all these things, right? But like something low intensity, something sustained low intensity conflict. Somebody was actually just speaking the other day, I'm forgetting who, so forgive me for that, but if you Google it, you can probably find it. Somebody was talking the other day about the Rwandan genocide and the role that the church played in it, and the role of the church sort of intersecting with authoritarian politics. As an example, as a blueprint for this, we are not Rwanda, but again, I do think that there are enough historical examples of how this can go really wrong really fast that we're just doing ourselves a disservice if we don't take it seriously. It's the best answer I can give. Because again, I'll end it by saying this. If you look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, what started as, Putin started giving these speeches like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, talking about the erosion of our values, right? And he would bring that up, talking about just basically like the culture wars in Russia, but the music, the gay rights movement, some of what was in the sort of pop culture complex, like and he was pointing to it and saying, this is a coordinated attack on our values, right? Like who is the our in this? Now, what's interesting is that Putin himself is not a religious man, but he became very proficient in weaponizing and deploying religious rhetoric with the help of Patriarch Kirill. And when you look at the distance traveled between Putin beginning to lay that groundwork 10, 15 years ago, and then the invasion of Ukraine, where Putin and Patriarch Kirill are basically saying, you are going to fight against Satan in Ukraine, that this is good versus evil, and that you will be rewarded by God for participating in this fight. Listen, folks, I have spent the last 4 years traveling the country, and the amount of times unsolicited that a pastor or church leader or somebody in this movement has said to me that this is no longer red-blue, this is no longer right-left, this is no longer conservative-liberal, this is no longer Republican-Democrat. This is good versus evil. The number of times that has been said to me is shocking. And when you begin to adopt that mentality that our everyday partisan disputes are actually a proxy for good versus evil, you can't negotiate with evil. It has to be defeated. And that, I'm afraid, is the mentality of far more people in this country than we are comfortable acknowledging. One more.
I feel like more and more I hear politicians claim that Jesus would have been Republican, or Lauren Boebert saying that Jesus would have had an automatic weapon if he was alive today. I was just wondering, like, how have you dealt with the hypocrisy on the gun issue? And do you think it's just the loudest voices saying it, or do you think evangelicals are actually changing their views on this point?
Oh, man. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I'm not, but I am. So, yeah, look. If you recall, when Jesus is arrested, he actually mocks his captors, the guards that come out to arrest him, as they're marching him into the court to be tried, and he looks at them with their weapons, and he says, "You come and brandish clubs as though I'm leading a rebellion?" In other words, the entire thematic through line of his ministry was, I am not here to fight the Romans, right? The Jews had been waiting hundreds of years for their prophesied Messiah, and they all thought he was going to come in on a chariot with a sword, and that he was going to murder all the Romans, that he was going to conquer their conquerors, and that he was going to restore Jerusalem. And even Jesus' disciples, after they'd been following him for several years, they're arguing about who's going to sit at his right hand when he becomes king. And he's looking at them like, dude, are you not listening to me? My kingdom is not of this world. I'm going to get to your point about guns more specifically, but it is just astonishing to me that anybody who calls themselves a Christian or who attends church could not understand this basic thing, that all of the Jews in that context, in that moment, were waiting for a military strongman who was going to come and rally the troops and slaughter the Romans and was going to restore to them the kingdom that was rightly theirs. And instead, it's this vagrant preacher from the ghettos of Nazareth who comes along with a decree of nonviolence and says, no, my kingdom is not of this world. It's a different kingdom. It's a different thing. And they're all looking around like, what's he talking about? Right? So this idea, when Lauren Boebert comes out and says, well, if Jesus had had an AK-47, the Roman government wouldn't have been able to kill him. What? What are we talking about here? Again, Peter takes out his sword, cuts off the guy's ear. Jesus rebukes him. Pilate says to him, "Are you a king?" And Jesus says, "Yeah, my kingdom's not of this world. If it was, my supporters would not have allowed me to be handed over to you." This is, okay, so I'll transition from the theological into the practical political. I don't know if you recall this moment during the 2022 midterm elections, but Sarah Huckabee Sanders, former Trump press secretary, future vice presidential nominee. I'm only half kidding when I say that. I'm only half kidding because I think that she might actually be the pick. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is campaigning in Arkansas, and she says, some of you may remember this clip, she says, in Arkansas, we're going to make sure that a kid is as safe in the womb as he is in the classroom. And of course, the irony of that is that in 2022, gun deaths became the leading killer of children in the United States for the first time. Gun deaths. More than car accidents, more than everything, all these other things, gun deaths, right? So the kid's going to be as safe in the womb as in the classroom. Really? Well, how safe is he in the classroom? Or she in the classroom? It is a drain on the credibility of the evangelical movement and of the Christian church that those who profess to be pro-life seem often to only care about life in the womb. But when it comes to feeding and clothing the orphan, when it comes to assisting the single mother, when it comes to taking care of the sick and the vulnerable and the people who can't pay for medical expenses, when it comes to gun deaths that exceed every other country in the world combined times 1,000, that they're silent. It's not just that they pay it lip service and then sort of wink and nod and move on. They're just silent, right? And you ask yourself why. It comes back to this gentleman's question earlier. You know, because it's uncomfortable. If you're going to run for office as a Republican, well, your base wants to hear the rah-rah about abortion, right? But the second you say, yeah, I also think that maybe we should revisit this, you know, the ban on high-capacity magazines. Nope. Not getting elected then, right? So you have to choose. And again, your theology is meant to inform and direct your life in a way that, if you are true to it, is going to put you all across the political map and is going to make you terribly inconsistent as a partisan, but boy, it's going to make you consistent in Christ. And you can choose that route, and it's going to be a struggle for you. It's going to be a struggle socially. It's going to be a struggle probably in your family, with your friends, in your relationships, right? It's going to be a struggle. But you're going to have a heck of a better time in your walk with Jesus. Or you can do it the other way around. You can try to conform all of your partisan political positions. You know, I have this pastor in the first chapter of my book saying, you know, there's something about America, right? God-given rights. Second Amendment. A lot of Christians think that's a God-given right. You go to the UK or Australia or New Zealand or you name the other country, and you say to a Christian there that owning an AK-47 is a God-given right, and they're going to say, huh? It is? A God-given right? So you can find ways to justify any partisan political position and sort of fuse that to your theology, and you wind up looking like the bionic man, right? Like that's your choice. You can do that. But it's going to come at the expense of your credibility as a messenger for Jesus. It just is. And by the way, I would say to, you know, the person out there listening who is of a liberal political persuasion, and you know, you're a Democrat and you're terrified of this moment, you're terrified of Trump, and you know, so therefore you have checked some of your own convictions that would lead you to take positions that would align with the Republican Party because of this moment, because of the fear that you feel and the threat that you sense. I would say the exact same thing to you. If you feel a theological conviction that is really inconvenient for your politics, you have to hold that Bible back up as a mirror and think really hard about where your identity really lies. And that is one heck of an uncomfortable thing to do. But again, as I said earlier, the natural state of Christianity is one of homelessness. And I think once you accept that, you can begin to embrace it. But it's hard to get there. I really want to just thank you guys. I know the crowd has thinned as I've gone on blabbing for what seems like an eternity here, but it's really an honor to be here, and I appreciate you sitting through my sermonizing, and I'm just really grateful. I hope you all get home safely. Thanks.